The Papists in England and Wales, 1560–1640. The word Papist, by the way, is a rather insulting contemporary term for Roman Catholic. They have an interest to us in the present day, partly because they're a minority. Minorities of all sorts tend to be a contemporary interest, although nowadays they tend in Europe to be racial rather than religious. But the treatment of religious minorities is, I think, still important in Asia. Anyway, so let's get back to our period and see how this minority was treated. Now, in 1560, some sort of Catholicism was normal among English and Welsh people. Protestantism had been officially re-established, and there was a fairly strong minority interest in it, but it wasn't yet predominant. However, it was on the offensive. Catholic belief, if normal, was both stagnant and conservative. The religious enthusiasts, the people who were making all the running, were the Protestants, particularly those back from Geneva, of Calvinist inspiration. They'd been in Geneva during the Catholic Queen Mary's time, who became the English Puritans, or the founders of the English Puritan Party. Now, the Queen Elizabeth was personally conservative. She was probably some sort of Protestant, but very much a pre-Calvinist one. Personally conservative and politically comprehensive. Although the Church of England was essentially Protestant in doctrine, her new Church of England, she tried to maintain as many Catholic rituals and practices, including robes and altars, as possible, not to offend what she knew to be the vaguely Catholic inclinations of the majority of her subjects. Now, I must be careful when I say Catholic. Catholic does not necessarily mean Roman Catholic, loyal to the See of Rome and the Pope, but generally Catholic in outlook and belief, which could be reconciled with being a member of the National Church. After all, it had been under Henry VIII, Elizabeth's father, in the 1530s and 40s. However, what interests us here is the survival, I think, of Roman Catholicism, insultingly called popery or papism in the time. That survived. People were not just sort of somewhat bovinely, vaguely Catholic. Quite a few people realized quite consciously and intellectually that they were Roman Catholic at heart. They could see the distinction. And there were many Roman Catholics' objections to the new Church of England, in spite of the Queen's best efforts. It was essentially Protestant in doctrine. The rituals didn't fool them, the somewhat Catholic rituals, which are still there today. And obviously it had repudiated the Pope, whose importance to Roman Catholicism had been hammered in by the events, both positive and negative, of the intervening 30 years. The Roman Catholic episcopate of Queen Mary's time had been deposed, but not killed or persecuted, and was now, until they died off, a shadow true hierarchy for Roman Catholics, as opposed to the official Anglican one. And in the 1560s, a normally domestic and fairly covert Roman Catholicism was practiced in manor houses, houses of other substantial people. We're not sure about the humbler people, but they sometimes went to services in the local manor house. And there were still surviving Catholic priests around who had been dispossessed. But they would die off fairly soon, especially as Tudor lives are much shorter than ours, and they needed to be replaced. And from the mid-1570s they were, to the government's disgust and astonishment, they were replaced. You had the Catholic missioners to England from the seminaries on the continent, Jesuits and others. The most famous are the Jesuits Parsons and Campion in the 1580s. And Edmund Campion, was martyred, caught by the authorities, and eventually executed for being a Catholic missionary. There's a college, a Jesuit college, named after him in Oxford today, Campion Hall. And they didn't reconvert the whole of England to Catholicism, of course, but they did preserve a Catholic hard core, known also as recusants, from the Latin I refuse to conform to the established church. At the same time, by 1580, Roman Catholicism was being seen as more of a political threat, because it was thought of as being backed by the Pope and the King of Spain, who were intermittently fire-breathing, menacing England with war, So perfectly ordinary English Roman Catholics who'd always lived in England, but always been Catholic, were almost considered as agents of the King of Spain by this accident. Missionary priests were certainly considered as potential agents of Spain, even if they weren't, and ran the risk of getting tried and executed rather nastily. So a vicious circle was created. Because English Catholics and their priests were persecuted in the 1580s, they were often driven into treasonable activity, which seemed to justify the government agents who persecuted them in the first place. Well, now we come to King James I, the first Stuart king, who succeeded Elizabeth in 1603, his cousin. The situation became less fraught for Roman Catholics, but there was still the Gunpowder Plot of 1605, where a few Catholics tried to blow up both king and parliament. But in fact, this was a sign of Catholic desperation and powerlessness, not of Catholic strength. Overall, however, there was a relatively stable religious situation compared with the 1560s, largely because Catholicism had definitely lost. By 1603, England was overwhelmingly Protestant, and the really religious fights were within the Protestant Church between Puritans and less extreme Protestants. The Roman Catholics, although feared as bogeymen, were really on the side. And James humanely neglected to enforce the laws against them most of the time. He even offered them toleration at one point, officially, but this didn't work. They were a decided minority, were Roman Catholics, concentrated in remote areas like Yorkshire and Lancashire and on the Welsh borders. But their perception as a threat did not totally vanish. Under James, and especially under Charles, his son, who succeeded him in 1625, there was an alarming revival of Roman Catholicism, not among the people in general, but among the upper elite and at court. Many of the peers converted to Roman Catholicism. Even worse, James's Queen Anne, a Danish princess, converted to Catholicism. And Charles went one better. He married a Catholic princess, Henrietta Maria of France, an alliance, and her religion was tolerated at court. She was allowed her priests in the chapel, which shocked the now overwhelmingly Puritan gentry class and merchant class in general, say nothing of humbler people. Charles himself inclined to the Arminian version of Anglicanism, which could be crudely summed up as Catholicism without the Pope, and his chief bishop, who he made Archbishop of Canterbury, Bishop Laud, was the great exponent of this, and lots of people suspected Laud of simply being a Roman Catholic but not saying so. Some people even suspected the king of this, and that roused suspicions. In fact, neither Charles nor Laud were themselves Roman Catholics, but it looked like it visually. Charles also patronised art from Catholic countries, buying statues from Italy, patronising the Catholic painter Van Dyck, who, as I speak, in late 99, there's an exhibition of his paintings in London, Charles's court. So, at best, Charles and Laud were looked upon as Catholic fellow travellers. External threats conditioned Protestant attitudes. After 1618, the 30 Years' War got going in Europe. This meant that Spanish power was reviving. It seemed that the Spanish Habsburgs were taking the offensive against the Protestants of Germany, against the Dutch, with whom English Protestants had fellow feeling. This culminates in the Edict of Restitution, 1629, where the Emperor, the cousin of the King of Spain, promulgates an edict saying that all monastic lands in Germany should be restored to the Catholic Church. This is not, in fact, carried out, but alarmed the English elite a great deal because they felt that Charles, their own king, might follow suit and take away their monastic lands, which they'd enjoyed for 100 years or more, which formed the basis of their wealth in many cases. On the eve of the Civil War itself, you had the Irish Rebellion. Now, Ireland was a Catholic country within the king's domains. It wasn't an external threat like Spain. It wasn't really an internal threat like English Roman Catholics, who weren't really a threat anyway. Ireland was in the king's domains, but overwhelmingly Roman Catholic. The Irish were much mistrusted. The ratio of the population of Ireland to England was much higher than today, 3 to 5. Now it's about 1 to 20. The Irish were alien not only in religion, but in language. They overwhelmingly still spoke Gaelic, their own tongue, and in culture. So when they rose up and started massacring the English settlers in Ireland, this made the English parliamentarians very nervous, now assembled in the Long Parliament, made them distrust the king. Some even thought the king might be behind it, and brought civil war nearer. Throughout this period, something gets hammered in, which is still around in a way today. Protestantism becomes identified as a core element of mainland Britishness as opposed to being Irish, unless you happen to be a member of the recusant minority. This is illustrated by the Protestant heroes, Drake et al., beating the wicked Catholic Spanish at the Armada, and so on. Conversely, Catholicism comes to be thought of as somehow an enemy of being British, and the recusant minority, who ceased to be persecuted really after about 1680, and nevertheless tend to be mistrusted. Something of this attitude lingers today. The average Britisher, I think, tends to think of Catholicism as having a Mediterranean or an Irish stamp. And even though most people are sort of atheist or agnostic, they tend to be Protestant atheists and agnostics rather than Catholic atheists and agnostics. And also it's entered our culture in a secularized sense. I mean, Mrs. Thatcher and her liberal individualism she's by religion a Methodist anyway, very Protestant, but it's very hard to conceive of Mrs. Thatcher from a Catholic country. You can get Catholic socialism and clerical reactionaryism, but not a Mrs. Thatcher. She's a British or American phenomenon in ideology. So, even though people are not necessarily against Roman Catholicism today, they tend to think of it as somewhat foreign or unusual. This is mitigated, of course, by the fact that we have, mainly through Irish and European immigration, a larger Roman Catholic element than we had for most of the period since 1560. But of course, before 1560, the idea that Roman Catholicism was un-British or un-English would have been inconceivable. So it's all a historical phase.